Okay, welcome everyone to another edition of the AltAcChats podcast. My name is Kyle Ayrton. I'm one of your co-hosts, along with my fabulous colleague, Akila Jairam. I'm so pleased to be able to welcome you today, Ryan, to the podcast. I'm super excited to be able to feature you and to hear more about your story and your experience on the alternative paths beyond academia.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's really our pleasure to host you. Where we typically like to start is just to ask, like, would you mind introducing where you are in your career right now and what your current position is like?
Yeah, so right now I'm about 8 months into my first non-academic job. I'm a staff data scientist at Accelerated Diagnostics. I suppose I should do a little legal disclaimer. My views in this podcast are not representative of Accelerated Diagnostics Incorporated, nor do they reflect my affiliation with the University of Arizona as a designated campus colleague. The opinions are my own.
Understood. Yep. These are all personal perspectives and intended purely for personal use. Cool. Well, thank you. That sounds like a really cool position. It's also, I think, interesting that you have this connection still with the university. And I think, one concern that I hear a lot from folks on the academia side, a real concern, I think, is that it is very hard to let go of our academic connections and relationships and to feel like we will be distanced. I guess I would be curious, just like off the bat, do you feel that you still have like a nice opportunity to connect with your academic colleagues from your professional side?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's kind of a unique opportunity, right? So like when I was leaving my last position at the University of Arizona, I was working at Cybers, which is the Cyber Infrastructure Institute. And so like maintaining my affiliation with them was fairly pragmatic, since a lot of what I currently do is related to that, and kind of why I got hired at Accelerated in the first place is a data scientist slash microbiologist with some cloud computing experience, and they didn't necessarily have a lot of people on the team that had a ton of experience like developing computer software and applications to deploy in the cloud. So maintaining that, keeping that door open is pretty great. We also have some high-risk R&D projects that I can't really go into detail about with people at the University of Arizona. And so there's like a bit of a pipeline back and forth between our company, because we're based out of Tucson, and the University of Arizona. Like this summer, we have some actually graduate student interns, so that grad students can get some industry experience and kind of maybe sort of putting out some feelers if they want to stay on with us after they graduate and stuff like that. So I think keeping that path open, it hasn't been too terrible. Like I don't do a ton of extra work. I do a little bit of volunteering here and there with the Research Bazaar, which is affiliated with the University of Arizona, that some friends of mine started a long time ago. And then some volunteering with the Carpentries on campus, because I'm a Carpentries instructor, and I like doing that sort of stuff and helping people sort of learn how to code and do it reproducibly, because that's how I learned in grad school, and I feel like I'm kind of paying it forward when I help other people out like that.
For sure. I mean, I feel like my impression is that there is a lot of opportunity to teach good practice when it comes to learning how to code. I wish that there had been more support and infrastructure for that kind of teaching when I was going through grad school. I would guess that my experience probably reflects that of many others, which is that we have learned coding and kind of just picked it up as we went, Googling Stack Overflow, just, relying on the resources of all the brave souls that went before us. So I think it's really awesome that you're interested in that. Some folks might not know a lot about Carpentries. Would you mind just explaining what that is?
Yeah, so it's like an international nonprofit organization designed around increasing accessibility to reproducible practices and software for academics in particular. but a lot of companies can also do carpentry stuff as well. My affiliation with Cybers, we worked very, very closely with the Carpentries, so got to meet quite a few of those Carpentries people over the years. In particular, like Jason Williams at Cold Spring Harbor, he does a ton of outreach, education, and training. Jason and I worked on quite a few Carpentries and Cybers related training materials in my time at Cybers. Yeah, so like I think that it's all of the stuff that they have is free and available online. Like you don't even necessarily need to attend a carpentry session. I particularly liked it when it was still in person. With the pandemic, I found it quite difficult to get the same sort of teaching experience doing it because they're, especially with the post-it note system, like Carpentries uses this thing where it's like, there's a red post-it if you need help, and a green post-it if you're good to go at certain checkpoints while you're learning. And it makes it very, very easy to run around and, you know, it's very much a hands-off approach. You don't, there was always this expression in the Carpentries instructor training where it's like, you don't want to drive someone's keyboard. You don't want to push them out of the way and sit down and be like, no, like this is the command you need to type. And so it's like sort of put your hands behind your back, lean over their shoulder if they have the post-it note up and say like, well, what do you see? Like kind of getting people comfortable with the idea that when you're writing code and executing it, you get a lot of exceptions and errors, and like that's part of learning. And it's like, you're not going to get it to work 100% every single time you sit down to try and write something, program to do a thing.
Yeah, one thing that has struck me is like the somewhat blasé attitude towards like getting warnings when you run code. Like, you know, if I get a warning, you know, if I'm running something in R, I'm like, nah, it ran, it works. Like I want to be kind of aware of that, but like if you hit a real roadblock, like if it throws an error, if it won't run, like that's where you really need to dig in and see where the issue is. It's super helpful to know about the Carpentries. So for, you know, I also want to acknowledge like it is truly challenging to consider trying to train people and teach using the virtual format. I think with the world that we're in, moving ahead, we will probably always need to invest in hybrid approaches. It's important from an accessibility standpoint. Some of us, you know, I definitely relate to you. I have had a lot of enjoyment with doing in-person training and learning. I found it to be kind of challenging to like imagine what the other person is saying on their keyboard if I'm not there. But we have experimented with trying to teach via Zoom. I guess, so are the carpentry resources easily available online, like in terms of video recordings?
I'm not sure about video recordings. I think for legal reasons, they share those among the people that participated in the online workshops. I haven't been heavily involved with the online workshops as of late, so I can't really speak to it. I know when we did the Cybers trainings, that it would be like emailed out to the people that signed up, right? And then there would, some of the stuff I think got posted to like the YouTube channel for Cybers. But the sort of lesson materials are always freely available for anybody to work through on their own. And I think that's something that's quite unique about the Carpentries. It's like they have like software carpentry, which is very much focused on like software engineering, and then data carpentry, which is a bit more domain science related. They have things for and I think even like library carpentries as well, about like information science, information retrieval, metadata parsing, that sort of stuff. And so it's a lot of these things that like if somebody is really thinking about making a transition from being academic into working as a data scientist, it's like these are some sort of things that tend to fall either in the must-haves or nice-to-haves category of like the job descriptions. It I think depends where you're looking, and you know, obviously Google or large tech company is going to have much more stringent requirements for like a data scientist than like a biotech company who might value domain expertise a little bit higher than pure mathematical aptitude.
For sure, yeah. It seems that like a little bit of these like grounding in technical skills coupled with that amazing domain expertise, which frankly, I think many folks in academia may take for granted, that they're really at the leading edge of what they're studying. That can go a long way. That being said, I would love to hand it over to Akila, kick it off with the next round of questions.
Thank you, Kyle. I think, Ryan, one question we had in mind is, how did you get started in academia and how did you end up in a data scientist position? So what happened along that journey?
So this is a fun, I enjoy telling this story because my partner always says that I describe who I am as a scientist differently every time I tell the story. Because, so I guess I'll start at like undergrad. That probably makes the most sense contextually. Nobody needs to know what I did in my high school years. So I went to the University of Wisconsin, Madison, graduated in 2009 with a bachelor's of science in microbiology. In my time there, I did a lot of work in a pathogenic fungi lab. So I did a lot of classical genetics. We had this crazy, it was pre-CRISPR. So we had like this very convoluted, like we would build a plasmid in E. coli, conjugate it with agrobacterium tumefaciens, and then put that on top of the fungi and just cross our fingers and hope that like the RNAi plasmid would make it in there and we'd get some knockdowns or knockouts. So it was like RNAi and like double vector transformations, and that was my introduction. I sort of worked my way up from being the dishwasher and media maker into like working directly under a postdoc and executing some experiments. So like super, super invaluable experience for just kind of cutting my teeth in the lab. It was nice to have like a paid lab job by the end of undergrad. But then, you know, since I graduated in 2009, the recession. So I ended up working a ton of odd jobs. I think I'll give you the highlights of that. So I worked in a factory making hydraulic manifolds on an assembly line. And then I worked in as a lab tech at the Medical College of Wisconsin in the biophysics department, which I like to describe that job as like a protein farmer. So I just grew up like liters and liters and liters of E. coli with single point mutations, and then handed them off to the biophysicists who did electron paramagnetic resonance experiments to look at the structure. So then that was a crash course in like academic sort of life because the grant didn't get renewed, so my position was not renewed. And then I was kind of like, okay, now what? I was kind of banking on that to work for a while and think about going to grad school. And so I went out for a bike ride one day, and I was like, I really need a job. Like I can't just be on unemployment. And so I actually ended up working as a bicycle courier for like 2 years in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 365 days a year through the harsh winters and everything like that. Got hit by a car on the job. It was my fault. I ran a yellow, and I should have just stopped. Didn't quite calculate the intersection, and I was laid up for a couple of weeks. And I thought, the heck am I going to do with my life? And then from there, I started to work at this aquaponics company, Sweetwater Organics, in Milwaukee, and got super interested in urban agriculture, controlled environment agriculture. Started thinking about the microbiology and going all the way back to probably my most influential professor that I had in undergrad, Dr. Cameron Curry. I was a National Academy member, and just an all-around nice guy. And so like I took microbial ecology as like one of my last classes, and I was like, why was this one of the last classes? This is like, if I would have taken this early on in my education, my career might have been way different. But so I started thinking about that in the context and asking questions at work, and nobody could really answer the questions that I was asking about the system that we were running. And then I got kind of just like linked up with my PhD advisor, Dr. Ryan Newton at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee School of Freshwater Sciences. I was his first PhD student, which is a bit of a gamble for grad students, but Ryan's an awesome mentor and like a really nice person. So that it was very supportive, and I basically got to design my own dissertation, like under his guidance. So like he just kind of like he saw that I was interested in the controlled environment agriculture stuff, showed me the recirculating aquaculture system in our department, and then it was just off to the races, just asking all of these sort of questions in between, like process engineering, aquaculture, and microbial ecology, and relating it back to the environment. And so that's sort of how I ended up going through graduate school. So I did almost all of my work on recirculating aquaculture systems and aquaponics systems. For listeners that don't know what aquaponics is or aquaculture is, it's fish farming. And aquaponics is the combination of hydroponics with the fish farming, where the fish excrement is used to supplement the nutritional requirements of the plants. So I was very, very interested in this because it's essentially like a closed ecosystem, and like from an ecologist perspective, like that's really awesome because you just control like the weather essentially. So you've eliminated one of the most like Lorentzian variables that you could possibly have for like your system. So I did that all through grad school. I got sort of caught up in complete ammonia oxidizing bacteria. So I sort of blundered into it in the middle of some experiments, and that sort of, I think that's what kind of shifted my trajectory back towards academia. I was thinking about this before we got on the podcast, and like, because like when I went into grad school, I was like, I want to do this. I want to work in controlled environment agriculture, like definitely interested in consulting, like very much interested in the business side of things. And then it's like finding something that no one else knows is like such a huge dopamine hit. It's hard not to get really excited and obsessive about something when you feel like you've unlocked a universal secret that you and maybe like 3 other people are aware of. And so that kind of shifted my perspective, and I started just applying for postdocs and interviewing around. I was very fortunate enough to, in my graduate years, to Brian, my advisor, who's very confusing, 2 Ryans in the lab. He emphasized that I go to a conference every year and network with people, whether it was like, he said it didn't matter if it was like industry or academia. And I think my conference choices got narrower and narrower to the point where now I was very much focused on finding a postdoc. So I came to the University of Arizona to be a postdoc, Paul Perini's lab, environmental science department, where I like completely abandoned aquatic systems and went straight into like soil microbiology. And sort of started one of his lab's major research paths right now, which is looking at how microbes survive drought and wetting in like the Sonoran Desert. It doesn't make any sense. They should explode as soon as it rains. And then I was doing a ton of bench work, but I was really interested in like the modeling side and spending a lot of time developing a model of this droughting, wetting thing. And Paul and I didn't necessarily see eye to eye on that as like an expenditure of my time. And so I ended up transitioning into the School of Information. I got a second postdoc. My mentor, that's where I met a lot of my current mentors or past mentors, depending on your perspective. I still talk to all of them, and we talk about science and technology and stuff like that. So I went and worked with Brian Hydorn, who was the former department chair. So I went from like 2 very junior PIs to like someone that's reaching the end of their career and getting ready for retirement, which was kind of great for like that time in my life, because it allowed me the freedom to sort of play around with data and explore this sort of notion that I was building in my head of like, I did all of this ecology. I know more math than I think I did, at the time. And I was like, oh, this data science thing is really cool. Like, I would love to just sit down and like chug away at some data. And so like that pivot to the School of Information was pretty great. Met some great collaborators through that. We were on this massive multi-institutional, like high, like risk project, trying to predict phenotypes from the gene environment interactions on like an ecological scale. So that was like a really interesting question based on my sort of scientific background. And then the funding for that project ended. It was a high-risk project. And I transitioned to working over at Cybers because my partner and I really like Tucson, and it was kind of like one of those things where it's like the academic trajectory of like, okay, you do a few things here and now you pack up your life and you move somewhere else, and then you keep repeating that until you pack up your life and move into your like tenure track job and cross your fingers and hope you get tenure and stay in the place. So both of us had been doing long distance for a while I was finishing my PhD, and neither of us really wanted to move again. Fell in love with the Sonoran Desert and the mountains here. It's a hidden gem, so don't move to Tucson, or do.
That's right. We recommend to our listeners, no one move to Tucson because
yes, it's really hot in the summer. That's a good deterrent. It's like almost 100 degrees Fahrenheit right now. And that's kind of like how I started to, and then it was like the pandemic happened. I was teaching, and I also had a data science fellowship at the time that I was in the iSchool, where it was like this grant that the university got from like the state of Arizona to try and start to train life scientists to transition into data science. So it was like kind of a mixture of computer science people, math people, and biologists that could code in that cohort. And so, yeah, that was sort of how I ended up in the data science track. And after a while of teaching online for the pandemic, I was just, the decision fatigue of teaching is well documented in like the scientific literature. And I think being online, the decision fatigue is accelerated because you're like constantly running around checking like who's got their hand raised in like the Zoom chat and stuff like that. So I was really looking to try and like break into like the biotech industry or tech bio, depending on the perspective at that point. And I had floated out a few applications, and then the one at Accelerate Diagnostics in Tucson stuck. So right now I work hybrid, spend a few days working from home because sometimes working at open concept office, you just need some quiet time to do math, write code, like not hearing like random loud conversations like that somehow transcend the noise canceling headphones. Yeah, so that's kind of how I ended up in my current role. So a little bit about what Accelerate does for context and why I got hired there. So Accelerate Diagnostics is focused really on sepsis, which is like blood infections. And so what we're really focused on is rapid antimicrobial susceptibility testing. So we got one product on market called Pheno, and that's deployed in quite a few teaching hospitals and private hospitals at the moment. And we just launched our second on market product called ARC, which is MALDI-TOF prep for clinical micro labs. Super cool. Just pop one tube in, get your MALDI-TOF prep sample out the other end, put it on the mass spec, and find out what's making the patient sick. And so right now I work on the algorithm development team in the R&D department, which has been really cool because it's like, I think some people making that transition from academia to industry think that you don't necessarily have like a ton of freedom to like work on intellectual problems, but I think it's all about context, right? Like even in the academic context, you still need to have a grant to work on what you're interested in. And so if you work somewhere where you're working on interesting problems that are helping people, like you'll find something that you'll get to kind of just be the product owner of and just like do some cool science. It's amazing kind of the difference, right? Like I think that's like, it's thinner than people realize.
Absolutely. And sorry, Kayla, I don't mean to jump. I may have to transition over to another meeting soon, regrettably, because Ryan, your story is amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I am excited to let Akila continue to coax some more information out of you, these gold nuggets that you're dropping for us. I would just love to acknowledge one of the last pieces that you said about how, I think there's a fear from a lot of people on the academic side that you will lose freedom, like you won't have flexibility to pursue your intellectual interests. I'm very freshly on the biotech side, so a couple of weeks at the new company. And I found that like, I agree with you. I feel like it's a lot more similar than people are really aware of. Like, yes, we are focused ultimately on the end goal, which is like, you know, getting products to market. Congratulations to you guys, by the way, for getting your products out there. That's super exciting. But like the academic side is not, it doesn't seem to me to be so different because you also have a product, which is like the paper that you're pushing towards. And you are kind of constrained by what you can get money for. And like, yeah, I mean, you have infinite flexibility, some would say, to plan like how you're going to approach your day, but you don't have infinite flexibility with where and how you can get funding to continue your research. And companies simply, I think, have access to other streams of funding and they can define their own paths too. So I feel like there are a lot more similarities than people realize.
Yeah, and the paths to funding can overlap too, right? Like there's a bunch, we have a couple of grants with the University of Arizona, like through the NSF and the NIH. And it's like, it's still doing the same, it's the same thing. And I work for a company, except we can ask venture capitalists for more money for an R&D project or something like that. It's, yeah, I think that's pretty spot on, Kyle.
Thank you. Yeah, in a lot of ways, I feel as if it captures, in essence, the best of both worlds. So with that, again, thank you so much, Ryan and Akila. I trust you to turn it over to you. I would love to stay in touch, and I hope I can talk with you guys real soon.
Thanks, Kyle.
I will hop out here.
Thank you, Ryan, for that illuminating story. I think that was super interesting, the way you went in and out, and then you did a couple of postdocs and how it segued into your journey into industry. So one thing I wanted to pick up on was about how you found the AltAc track. So you mentioned the fellowship, but did you speak to people? How did that process look like? Because a lot of the time our followers, ask about how do you make this transition? It's not a very clear-cut path. So any insight on that would be very helpful.
Yeah, so I had quite a few friends sort of just starting to opt out, I guess, of academia and start to work in industry. For some more context, I also have, some scientists in my family, and none of them work in academia. So that was like a pretty big thing. Like one of my cousins is like the CTO at a company that does some data storage and data optimization and infrastructure products. His background's in applied physics. Another friend who works at pharma company, like a pharma startup in Salt Lake City area. And I also have quite a few friends who have made the transition directly into data science from other areas. And so I think the network was there. It was just waiting for like me to ask these people, right? Because I think, it come up like my partner and I were at our friend's wedding, and one of her friends brought up, like, oh, you should just go into industry. And I don't generally like being told like what to do with my life. So like, I think it kind of doubled down. I'm like, no, I think I'm gonna keep applying for faculty jobs. And so, yeah, I think that it was always kind of in the back of my mind. I think it was just a matter of for the scales to tip the other way. Kind of like I said, I went into grad school and I was very much interested in industry, and it shifted midway through. And I think it's just a different mindset, and talking like to people like Vega from the first episode, through meeting her when she was working at Galt, like I think it was like this sort of like like whispered question like in my academic lab where I'm like, so like what is it? Like how are you doing? Like what is it? And I think if people are interested in in making this transition, and they don't necessarily have like the same network of people that I do, you'd be surprised, especially in social media, how many people like LinkedIn or Twitter, like if you're like, I'm trying to make this transition, what should I do? I think it's yeah, like people are very willing to help you out, because like it's not as scary. It doesn't have to be as scary as it seems at face value.
Absolutely. I think my experience mirrors that. I mainly use LinkedIn for my journey, but I was surprised how receptive people are, and everyone's so, they're willing to talk to you for a 15-minute chat, and then you sort of build on that as you go along. But I guess Twitter is also a very important resource. I've joined recently, but I've seen our AltAcChats account. It's grown to 4,000 followers now in a span of a couple of months. So you can see how, there's a community building around this. Um, yeah, so that's super interesting. And sort of, how do you feel from when you first transitioned to now? You're 8 months in. So how do you feel? What were the things you wish you had known, or things that you learned as you went along?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I went in absurdly nervous. My boss, Niels Opperman, is an ex-theoretical physicist. So like the mathematical aptitude that he possesses, and I'm on the algorithm development team with him and other people with backgrounds in applied physics and computer science and engineering. And I'm this just like wayward ecologist sort of floating through my scientific career. So it was like, it was a lot of like sort of, I don't necessarily call it, I don't really like imposter syndrome, because the whole fake it till you make it thing implies that there's some sort of external validator that will eventually let you know that congratulations, you've made it. And like, it's making something of something's deeply personal experience. So I guess it was like kind of getting over that initial fear of like, do I even belong here? Oh my gosh, there are all these like ridiculously smart people that have worked at very prestigious companies, and I'm just this recently graduated person. But then I came to find after I got into the company for a while that a lot of the PhDs were like, had done like the postdoc hopping and stuff like that. And so it was like, one employee had their like 8-year anniversary with Accelerate Diagnostics, and they came fresh out of a postdoc into it. And they were describing in our all employee meeting the same feelings that I had when I, like at that moment in time. And I was like, oh, this is normal. Like everybody feels weird. It's a pretty abrupt shift. And now it's like, I feel way more relaxed than I did when I was an academic, a full-time academic, I guess. I would categorize myself as a hobbyist academic at this point. And like, yeah, that it's just like a nice mental shift after a while, where you're just like, sudden, like people, it's strange because I feel like in academia, I never really got a ton of like, nice job, like good work on that, like that one thing. And it's like, do you get a lot of positive feedback from like incremental progress? And I feel like it's, some academic circles, it's like, well, where's the paper? Like, yeah, congratulations, your analysis finished. Like, now write about it and put it, and let's figure out a journal to publish it in. But I think there's like, since you don't have that like paper goal at the end, it's all the incremental progress is intellectual property of the biotech company. So everybody's really excited about small, like little, they always use, people at work always use the term learnings. And I kind of like that. It's like this incremental learnings as a group while you're working on developing a new product it's really exciting and interesting. And I think it's very collaborative. The team, the R&D department is quite large, probably about like 15 microbiologists and like 12 people working in software engineering and data science supporting that. So, and like half a dozen engineers like designing the products themselves. So it's like, and on external partners. you know, contracting out some work on things that we don't necessarily have the expertise in. So I think it's been a cool transition. I think it's really opened my eyes to the business side of science that I've always been interested in, but never really had any experience with. And becoming sort of financially literate in like the startup context pretty quickly, because it was interesting, right? Like I think we're all scientists and we're all interested in new information. It's sort of just opening your mind to like, this is something new that I should probably know, and just kind of moving forward.
Yeah, super interesting. So I also wanted your comments on one other thing. So what do you think about structure? Because in academia, you mentioned there's just the paper and then you're left to your own devices until you get there. So how does structure look like in a biotech company in your view?
I think it varies wildly from company to company. Like based on talking to like friends and family and at other businesses, I think that I do have quite a bit of autonomy to work on problems that I'm interested in. And I think that that's pretty valuable. I think that like maybe the question you were angling for is more like the organizational structure of the company. Yeah, so that was a bit of an interesting thing where it was like on my second day, like the CEO sat down next to me at like the all-employee meeting and started talking to me, and I was like, this is cool, but this is kind of like it's just like asking me like who I was as a person, and it was like, oh, like this is really interesting. So I think like, you know, familiarizing myself with like, oh, like this is a company. The board of directors is steering the direction of the company. The C-suite reports to the board of directors, and then it's sort of like, you know, people at work might say we have a flat leadership structure, but it's still somewhat hierarchical. I don't think it's all that dissimilar to academia, but I think that there's a lot more willingness to listen to all of the employees in my experience at Accelerate.
That sounds great. So just as a closing off question, what advice would you give to our folks who want to transition into data science, who might have been, you know, at that decision point you were many years, 8 months ago, sorry. What would you say to them?
I would say, you know more than you think you do, and like, especially focusing in on like, I think a lot of people, particularly, I guess I'll address the data science and I'll just talk more generally about the transition to data science. So I think specifically with data science, people get really hung up on, I want to use like the latest and greatest neural network schema, or like do some natural language processing, slap GPT-3 onto the back end of something to do an NLP task. But the reality, objective reality going into biotech in particular, you're not going to be doing that most of the time. I feel like I use convolutions more for just rote image and image, like classical computer vision tasks, and less of like less like building a predictive neural network or something like that. And I remember one of my first team meetings with my boss, who said, I brought up like this like AI like ensemble model that I had sort of doodled down on a piece of paper while we were meeting it. And he said, well, maybe we should focus on the I part before we involve the AI part. Like maybe there's a simpler, faster solution that works well enough for us to draw some conclusions so that we can, you know, adhere to a timetable that we're working on, right? It's like, that's all the investors have a timetable. It's a bit that it's very focused on the fiscal quarters, right? And I think academic years are very asynchronous with the world outside of the academy. Because it's like, it starts in the fall, it ends in the spring, it straddles the end of the calendar year, but like quarters just roll right by. Like I can't believe that we're already in like Q3 of 2022. So I think it's like the pace is quick, but I think the work is manageable. And I think that like don't get hung up on, like I said, like don't get hung up on like the highest technology stuff. Like that's going to be happening at big money companies like Microsoft, Google, IBM, wherever. The companies that do have like a huge amount of compute to do those heavy data science tasks, you already know enough as a scientist to do 95% of data science. And guess what? The 5% you don't know, since you have a PhD, you're probably really good at learning things at this point. Like that's like, I always say that like getting a PhD is like just learning how to acquire information quickly and like synthesize it and do something with it. So I think that's, those skills are kind of, they're very good to like fall back on. And your domain expertise can also really guide where you look for like data science jobs, right? Like, so like I started to like panic apply to jobs at a certain point, and I just sort of blanketly was like applying for like data science jobs, like information security companies. And it's like, I'm interested in InfoSec. I have zero experience working in that area. So like, I'm not an ideal candidate for that job. So like kind of finding things that align with your domain expertise is pretty great, right? Like, so, because like I find myself in meetings at my current role, having conversations and being somewhat of an intermediary sometimes, where it's like the microbiologists say something and then I'm like, oh, well, this is what that would mean in the context of like the data that we're gathering, like this new product that we're developing. And, or like, this is how this particular microbe could affect our measurements that we're taking. So like having that domain expertise is like super invaluable as a data scientist. Like you can be a mathematical generalist and do fine. But I think for people with bio backgrounds that are looking to make that transition into data science, like your biology domain expertise, you know way more than a lot of computer science and physics people, because you had to memorize so much stuff about biochemistry and genetics and like metabolism. It's you just know a lot more than your peers in that regard. And more of a pragmatic sense for people that are looking to transition generally outside of the academy into industry. I started to have way more success with job applications when I started to divvy up my resume. I had been sending, like sort of lazily at the end of my PhD, sending out my academic CV. But I think that that in academia, that's going to be received by the professor that's looking to do the hiring. And they want to look and see, like, if you have papers, if you presented, like, what is your sort of, well, whose lab did you work in, all that sort of stuff that like professors are interested in when they're hiring postdocs or even graduate students. In an industry, it's going to be an HR person, and they're going to see that it's like, a 10-page long thing, and then they're immediately going to put it in the no pile. Like you have to get through like the gate guard to get into the interview in the first place. So what I did was, since I have a bit of a background in I guess computational biology or bioinformatics, debatable what those terms mean. And so I had like a computational biology resume, data science resume, and then like a microbiologist resume. And so I tailored those to emphasize specific skills for those 3 categories of jobs that I was applying to in industry. And so like for people like myself that have more of an interdisciplinary science background, I think it's really hard to convince people in academia that you aren't just a generalist and that you know enough to be a specialist, which is what they want in like a professor. But in industry, like the generalist scientist, it's like super, super valuable. So like just tailoring it to emphasize something that most directly aligns with the job ad and then sort of fill in the rest with the cover letter. And then people, I found that like people were like super interested in like the fact that I had both wet lab and dry lab experience. So it was already a conversation starter for like interviews after I sort of completely reframed my resume, and also definitely have people look over your resume. I had a friend who didn't even work in academia, or sorry, didn't even work in biotech, look over my resume, because he was like a manager in marketing at a company. And so it's like having somebody that doesn't even know your industry look at your resume and say like, can I at least like understand that you've led some projects and done some things. And there's like a Google XYZ resume formula that is also quite useful for contextualizing your academic accomplishments. People might want to list like every single paper they've ever published as like a grad student, but like you could summarize that in one bullet point. It was like, I managed 2 undergraduates and this project resulting in 3 papers in high impact journals or whatever. Like it feels weird since like academic CVs are such a laundry list of accomplishments to you just gotta push your ego aside and realize that like the hiring manager doesn't want to look at that. You can bring it up with the people that are interviewing you once you get through the door, but I think that getting your foot in the door is the hardest part.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. I've seen it myself. When you tailor your resume, you definitely get a lot more response. Even here in the UK, it's the same all over the world, I think. And I think that's definitely something our listeners would value quite a lot. So Ryan, thank you again for coming and speaking to us and sharing your excellent insights and advice about transitioning into data science and also transitioning into industry in general. So we're very glad to have you, and thank you so much for giving us your time.
Yeah, thanks, Akila. This was great.